Here you are on the Sabbath, and this is a religious service. I can't tell that very much by the way you're dressed. One time I was in Texarkana, and I knew it must be a religious service because there were 3 or 4 guys showed up in old soiled white robes. They had soiled white wool socks, open-toed sandals, long flowing reddish hair, and they obviously were religious people. I asked one of them if he was banging for a bit part in a Jesus movie, and he didn't like that very well. But then I went to church one time, and there was a fellow sitting on the front row with a gigantic Mexican hat and a serape where he just had his head poked through a hole in this real colorful kind of a rug, you know, and he's sitting there with, I don't know, all kinds of boots and everything. And I said, "You going to a costume party afterwards?" And he just let me know, no, he was just there at church. Oh, I said, "Oh, just trying to call attention to yourself. I see." And, you know, a lot of times if I'm in a public place and somebody goes by and they're dressed in real weird garb, I mean, just weird. Now, you've seen people like this. I'll look at them. My wife will grab me and yank on my sleeve. "Honey, don't look." "Why? That's what they're trying to get me to do, aren't they?" Well, we've had people who've come to my services. We had this happen recently. Quite a large number of people who believe, and they probably are sincere in this belief, that they ought to wear robes. So they had, it wasn't a choral group, they weren't obviously choir robes, they were religious robes. Now in our society, if you see a lady approaching you wearing black and with a white thing out to here, you know, you've seen the picture in the movie about the flying nun. I guess they just said that if a high wind came up and you're wearing that kind of headgear and you got it tied down pretty good, you might just take off and fly. We do not react with alarm when we see someone in what is religious dress. Did God call you into religion? Now, you're here today, and this is what you do on the Sabbath as a part of your religion. Here you are. Now, horses don't do this. Dogs don't do this. Cows don't do this. Even birds don't do it. I thought they did when I was a kid because we'd be going to church at Albany, Oregon or someplace, and I'd see blackbirds sitting on the fence or sitting up on the high wires. And I said, "Look, Daddy, even the birds are going to church," because there were whole flocks of birds sitting there. But you don't see cows standing around in the field with one cow or a bull out in front, and he's kind of lowing and moving his head around, all the others are nodding. You don't see horses doing that. You don't see dogs doing it. But here we are, and we are doing this. Well, Monday morning, I shall be in the office, God willing, and the creeks don't rise. And I will be working on an article about evolution and about whether or not God exists and about the geologic succession of strata and about whether or not evolution is in fact a cultic religion based upon belief in nothingness as opposed to the belief in the true God. Tuesday, God willing, I will be in front of the cameras at my desk doing another television program which I hope will reach hundreds of thousands, if not a few million human beings. And so it goes Wednesday and Thursday and Friday. And all week long, this past week and any other given week, I am working in writing letters, dictating letters, writing articles, sometimes on a rare occasion a little minor administrative thing that I have to do which I really don't like, and it's not my, as they say in the vernacular, my bag, my thing, what I like to do or feel that I am cut out to do. So all week long, I'm engaged in religious activity. But you wouldn't know that by the way I dress, and you wouldn't know that by the way I talk. Now, you might know that if you watch the television program, or if you read some of the letters I write, or if you read the articles that I write. You would know that it has to do with religion. But you wouldn't know it by any other outward manifestations. I have my roots in a church which gradually grew to become a church very much like one with which Jesus had a great deal of difficulty in the first century. And I want to tell you about that church that Jesus ran across because they were a strange breed of cat. They believed just about all we believe. They knew which was the true Sabbath. They had no doubt at all about the annual holy days, and they kept them. Although they differed in dates, just like some of us differ with other people who have gone away from us, the Sylvan Six people and so on, about when they ought to observe a particular annual holy day. They tithed religiously and meticulously. They knew the truth about Israel because they were Israel. They were Jews. And I'm talking, of course, about the Pharisees. And back in those days, there were the liberals and the conservatives. And the Pharisees were conservative, and the Sadducees, who were the priestly caste that had control of the temple, were more liberal. You might remember the time when the Apostle Paul virtually caused a riot when he said before a group of these people who were differing in their beliefs about the resurrection, of the hope of the resurrection of the dead am I called in question this day. And they began a shrieking, riotous argument immediately about whether or not God was going to raise the dead. Well, the Pharisees understood there was no immortal soul. They knew about the version of hell that the Bible in the Old Testament teaches, that hell destroys the wicked and the righteous will tread down the wicked. So they knew an awful lot more than the mainstream fundamentalist churches of today, didn't they? They had the Sabbath, the only true sign, and they had a pretty good name when you stop to think about it. The word Pharisee merely meant an apartist. Apartheid is the Dutch Afrikaans word. This had nothing to do specifically with racial segregation, although it became that. And it really meant people who were apart, people who were different. But apart through a process I want to discuss with you, which also occurred in the church from which I was a refugee back in 1978, can become more than just apart. It can become better. Not just apart, but better. Now, all of the world's religions, whether you go back and look into ancient paganism, had to do with life. It had to do with a celebration of life, a worship of life, an understanding or an attempt to understand who or what thing, what force put those stars up there, and of course the energy that comes into this earth, from which ultimately all forms of energy are devolved from the sun, as you know. Whether you're talking about steam, well, the water that raises up in mist because of the sun's rays and comes back down in rain and forms rivers, and a man can build a hydroelectric project there, or maybe he can build a steam engine and convert it through fire, but the fire is only going to burn because of plants like trees or coal, which are old plants buried in the soil that ingested solar energy long ago. So that big furnace up there, the sun, is the ultimate source of our energy. Those pagans knew that, and they observed lunar months, and they observed seasonal progression, and they observed life in all of its myriad forms, especially human life. Some of their gods that they invented were pacifistic, and some were warlike. Some demanded living sacrifices. Some merely demanded long necks, like in Africa. And they would take wound portions of metal, and they would stretch a human neck until literally, if they were to take the windings of the metal away, the head would collapse of its own weight because the neck could not support, the neck column could not support the head. In China, they thought their god demanded bound feet. They thought it was beautiful for women to have little feet about that big. So they wrapped them very, very tightly until there was no circulation, as they were little girl babies. And you can read of that in some of the books that have to do with, like Taipan, if you happen to read that. But you can also look it up in an encyclopedia about Chinese history. Or in the case of some American Indians and other tribes, they believed that a flat head was very, very pretty. And so little babies were bound with a horrible big thick board against their skull and bound real tightly. As they would grow up, their head would be real slope-headed. Some of them thought their gods demanded tattooing, and some lacerations and bumps where they would actually insert some portion of dirt, a piece of sand or grit, and prick the skin, and it would then swell up and form a bump, and they would have beautiful tribal markings, and each one was different. So the tribes could say, oh, they're of this tribe or that tribe, because each one of these things they did made them apart, separate, different. And incidentally, since they were who they were, obviously, it made them better. Made them better. Are there any Pharisaical tendencies among even God's people today? And when I speak of God's people, in one sense of the word, if you look at both the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they were the inheritors of all that God gave Levi. They were the last vestiges of the Levitical priesthood in the form of the Sanhedrin, and as I said, the priestly caste of the Sadducees that had control of the temple. And the Pharisees, though they were a religious sect, had a lot more of the truth than you would begin to imagine. So does the truth of God, the Sabbath, the holy days, tithing, and all of that, which does make you certainly unique if you look at it in contrary to the mainstream fundamentalist religions of today, does it mean automatically you are God's true church? The Pharisees were apartists, and here is the way it happened. Just like many people today who hear the program, begin to ask for a piece of literature, they begin to study. First of all, perhaps they are made angry because they are wondering to themselves, just who does this guy think he is? This can't be true. There is an ever-burning hell. I've been told that all my life. Or yes, we do go to heaven when we die, and I know we do, and it's in there somewhere. Each bathtub shall sit on its own bottom, as Mr. Dart said in his correspondence course. I know that's in there somewhere. No, it's not, but they know it's in there. I've had people come up to me and tell me scriptures that are found nowhere in the Bible. Spare the rod and spoil the child. I know it's in there somewhere. No, it's not, but they know it's in there somewhere. So these people begin to feel surprised, shocked, and sometimes betrayed. If they eventually read far enough, and they come to what it says in Acts, the 2nd chapter, in verse 38, they should do, which is to see the tremendous array of truth that has just passed them by and of which they were blissfully ignorant, and with a shock come to repentance, they will begin to feel betrayed by civilization, by society. They discover with a shock and a gasp of amazement the rather ugly origins of a steeple on a church. They discover the rather ugly origins of Sunday, Solis Invictus. They discover the ugly origins of bulbs on a Christmas tree and little eggs and rabbits running around at Ishtar or A-star time. And they realize that society is absolutely shot through with paganism. And each little bit of this knowledge actually is prying them further loose from society, making them feel further apart from society, further removed from society. Now eventually, as they are gathered together in churches, fellowship groups, they come to begin to fellowship with a local congregation, another metamorphosis will gradually occur. People tend to cling together when they believe alike and think alike and act alike. And people who share secrets or who share knowledge and share all of this knowledge I'm talking about, true knowledge, tend to cling together. I've seen this metamorphosis occur in families. I remember one family where the wife was a Catholic and the husband was a newly converted member of God's church. They were both very outgoing people, and the church had the usual round of social affairs, like we just announced, we're going to have a chili cookout, and people enjoy that kind of thing. Church dances, church socials, Bible studies, films, young couples and singles meetings, and so on. They had speech clubs, they had mother and daughter and father and son picnics and outings. They had the usual things that practically any church will have, including maybe a Friday night or a Wednesday night Bible study, like all the Baptist churches around here. You go by on a Wednesday evening and the parking lots are full. And they just keep you in this constant cycle of activities, activities, activities. Now, because these were outgoing people, and this lady, even though she was a Catholic, was the kind of a person who made friends very easily, and vice versa. You felt you'd known her all your life in about 10 minutes. Little by little, she looked around one day and found that the only friends she had were in the church. And there were no more friends outside of the church. And it was just a logical metamorphosis that gradually she decided to look into it a little more and followed along with her husband and asked to be baptized and became a member of the church. She too had heard, as her husband had, and as I have preached and written about for so many years, Romans 12, 1 and 2, be not conformed to the world, but be you transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you might prove what is that good and acceptable will of God. She'd read Revelation 18:4, come out of her, my people, her being Babylon the Great, mystery, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. Again, this feeling of betrayal, this gasp of amazement to discover the utter pagan origins of so much around us in society. I'll turn to James 4:4, which epitomizes what I'm talking about because it is so poignantly to the point of how people begin to feel and how a very subtle thing begins to happen when they forget John 3:16 and they forget that Christ was the friend of harlots and publicans, And they forget that the Pharisees chided him very strictly for sitting down at the table with people of ill repute in their local community. And they forget that Jesus Christ of Nazareth never enjoyed a single conversation with a converted man. Christ never met a converted woman. But there are people in God's church today who will go to great lengths to avoid having any conversations with anybody outside of the church. People who love to be sort of in what I will describe as a religious implosion. They pull themselves into a little circle of people, and suddenly a part becomes better. And suddenly it's us, them. It's a whole different mindset. Beginning in the 4th verse of James 4, you adulterers and adulteresses, know you not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? That's strong. Now that means the guy that pumps gas at the service station, doesn't it? The lady that gives you the cleaning at the laundry or whatever. Friendship of the world is enmity with God. Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. But wait a minute, what does that really mean? Since it says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And the word means society. It means people in society. And since the Bible says very clearly, as Mr. Dart reminded you last Sabbath, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And you were reminded last Sabbath about how the disciples got into this Pharisaical attitude and wanted to burn with fire, calling down fire like Elijah, some people who simply refused Jesus a room for the night. And he had to rebuke them and say, you know not what spirit you are of, for the Son of Man came not to destroy men's lives, but to save them. So how do you reconcile the two? God loved us while we were lost in our sins. If he hadn't, we wouldn't be here. He doesn't love our sin, but he loves sinners. There's a difference. You can love a sinner, but now, do you really love a sinner when you feel outraged and you feel somehow besmirched and you feel somehow a partaker of his sins and you feel somehow that association with him will in some way soil your own garments? Jesus apparently did not feel that way, because on some occasions the disciples said, and of course leprosy was the epitome of this example, because not only in this case were they unconverted and the pariahs of the society, where they had to actually shout a warning as they're coming down the street, leper, leper, so people could get out of the way. But Jesus reached out and touched a leper, which no one in his right mind would ever do. And he allowed the town prostitute at a meeting in a Pharisee's house, who was Joe Pharisee Ichiban Boysan #1 in the community, and the woman, crawling on her hands and knees beneath the table, bawling and sobbing, is wiping Jesus' feet with her own hair, and people are murmuring, and Jesus, who read their thoughts because he knew what was in man, knew that they were saying to themselves, how could he allow that slut to even touch her, or him rather? Isn't it wonderful how well they knew her? It's just a thought in passing. All of them knew who she was. Anyway, knew exactly what her business was and how she earned her living. How could he allow that slut to touch him? If he knew who she was, he wouldn't allow that. But Jesus did know who she was. Time out. I want to tell you something about some experiences I've had. Shortly after the finest hotel in Tyler, which is the Ramada, was built, and they have a wonderful restaurant there. Matter of fact, we had a ministerial conference or two there. We've had some ministerial council meetings there upstairs in the boardroom. We had a going-away luncheon for one of our former employees there just the other day in a conference room. They happen to have a lounge that is right there beside and sort of a part of the restaurant. Get ready. You ready? I have been known to drink a beer. There are very few places. Well, now you've got to have a stack of cards that high if you want to go sign up because of the ridiculous blue laws, which are absolutely a violation of the principle of separation of church and state. But because of being a dry county, you have to be a member of a sort of a club. Well, I had stopped in there not too long after that place had opened. As a matter of fact, we met a very wonderful gentleman, Max Carey, who was legally blind, who wrote the words to a song that Frank Sinatra many, many years ago made very, very popular when I was 21. It was a very good year. Yeah, that was the song. It was a very good year. You may remember that. He was a very fine man. And the people in there know me. The manager knows me. We've had dealings with him because we've rented a lot of his facilities and so on. I was in there, and are you ready for this? Drinking a beer. Somebody pointed out to a lady who was in there who I was. She came over to me and she said, "Are you really Garner Ted Armstrong?" I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "I can't believe it. What are you doing in a place like this?" I said, "Why are you demeaning yourself this way?" She didn't understand what I meant. I said, "But you're here." She thought about it for a minute, you know. I said, "This is the nicest place in Tyler. My office is just a few blocks up the street. I'm sitting here having a beer. If I should have one more, that's my limit. That's all I'm going to have. That's it. Aren't you a nice lady? I hope you are." You know, talked to her a little while, gave her a little sermonette. She went away kind of puzzled. I guess she thought that I was a Baptist. But isn't that fascinating when you stop to think about it? She had never imagined that it was putting herself down to say, what would he be doing in the kind of a place I would frequent? Now, I know I'm hurting some feelings. I know I'm going to get a couple of letters. And you know what? I don't even care. Because if my Savior could sit down and talk to prostitutes, if my Savior never had a single meal, never had a conversation with a converted man, how is it that all of us, when we experience this shocking, shuddering, gradual prying loose from the world, this discovery one after another of more and more doctrine and more truth that makes us experience a religious implosion, sink down into a little local congregation, and from that time on, essentially, never have anything to do with the world outside our own windows, but become a part, which means better. Better. So do you understand now James 4 and verse 4 in the light of what Jesus said in John 3:16 that he loves the world? Let's turn to the 18th chapter of the book of Luke and verse 10. There's a beautiful song called "The Publican." And it is a very interesting song. 18 and verse 10. Two men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a publican. Now, you know that a publican was a tax collector, and he would carry a little bag with weights in it. And the Bible says a lot about weights. His little bag and all the accoutrements of his profession had to do with the various tables of conversion from Roman and other coins to the coin of the realm. It had to do with certain little weights and a little set of scales. And a lot of times they would actually weigh their money in those days because it was made of silver and it was according to a weight, like shekels and minas and so on. And that's why God says so much about the false balances and deceitful scales and illegal weights and all of that, because these people were known to cheat. And because they were intelligent and because they were oftentimes bilingual, and in that sense they were money changers, they were the commodities traders and Wall Street people of their day, they had a very bad reputation. So this Pharisee notices, of course, the publican standing there, and the Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. Interesting. Doesn't even say he prayed to God. It says he prayed with himself. Prayed with himself. Interesting. Thank God I am not as other men are. Thank God I'm me. You know, boy, I'm sure glad to be. Thank God I'm not like that guy. He was praying with himself. I thank thee that I'm not as other men, extortioners, thinking of the publican all the time, looking at him with bitterness and hauteur, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And the publican standing afar off would not so much as lift up his eyes unto heaven. Interesting that we tend to pray with our eyes downcast, and apparently they prayed looking up. I once saw a man do that one time at my father's funeral. I thought that was rather strange. But this Pharisee was doing that. He was looking up unto heaven, but not the publican. but smote upon his breast, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other, for everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbles himself shall be exalted. Interesting language, this inward analysis. And in the inward analysis, as the Pharisee thought about himself, thought of his apartism, of his separatism, of his fasting, of his tithing, of the doctrines he knew, he came out looking awfully good. He felt great about himself. Have you ever looked up the word liturgy? The word liturgy means public worship. It means public display of worship. Now, if you were going to start a church, you've got to have certain ritual. You've got to have certain forms of public worship. There is no ritual involved in what we did years ago when the neighbors around where we lived in Pasadena would begin to tell stories about these people with their many little children and their great big Bibles, or the people who would think we were very strange because everybody came toting a big Bible in a church and promptly whipped out a notebook and a pencil and put the Bible on their knee and the notebook overlapping the pencil and had their heads down busily taking notes the whole time. And to other people who had never done that in their lives, they thought, that is really weird. That's really strange. These people are acting like they're in some kind of a class, taking notes. We never insisted upon dress except that gradually, though it wasn't really a uniform, it became very, very bad for men to wear any socks that would allow the hair of your legs to show. Because hairy men's legs got to be very ugly. And so it became sort of a quiet subculture, just implicit knowledge, men should wear calf-length hose, not ankle-length socks. That kind of got put in place. Makeup went back and forth so many times, I kept getting whiplash. I almost got dizzy watching it go by. No makeup, yes makeup, no makeup, yes makeup, no makeup. Now it's back to yes makeup again. That happened, of course, however, over about 20, 25 years. It was okay when I was converted and came into the church, and in 1954 it was not okay. And then later on, I won't go into why, but it was okay. And then later on, about 7 or 8 years later, it was discovered that I had allegedly put that in without anybody noticing it. I don't know how people can not notice all the women sitting there with makeup, and nobody had noticed it. They discovered it all of a sudden, and I was a great liberal who had put in makeup behind somebody's back, and that was another reason why they had to get rid of me. And then they took it off, and as a matter of fact, one young man, can you imagine? Now, just think about this, because this is the epitome of the Pharisaical thing I'm talking about when a part becomes better. And when total control of a congregation. This is not some televangelist saying, now, say as I tell you, I'm going to reach out, I'm going to take unto myself this faith. Now reach out your arms. Everybody obediently reaches out their arms. Now take unto yourself this faith. What do they got? A handful of air. How long can you hold on to that air? Is that faith you got a hold of? I saw this guy go through these antics on television. This young man announces from the pulpit, to the absolute shock and dismay of his congregation, that there had been a new ruling came out from headquarters, no more makeup. So I hereby command all you women, get up from your chairs, go back to the restroom, and wash it off. You know how Mussolini used to stand on his, you ever see Mussolini on the balcony with the chin jutting out? You know, wouldn't it have been unbelievable if some woman's husband had gotten up, gone straight up that pulpit and grabbed that guy and just punched him out? It's a terrible thing to think of something like that happening in church. But you know, you can push some people so far they might just lose it. They might just lose it. You know what would have been even more appropriate? If some woman, utterly outraged, would have stomped up there and just absolutely slapped his face a ringing blow and walked out of church and said, I'm not coming back. Now that would have been even more poetic justice in my humble view. But it just shows you how far this kind of thing can go. If somebody wants to start a religion, it's awfully good to have certain dress, to decide certain things about the way you walk or the way you talk, some headgear, something to do with sideburns, something to do with whether or not a lady can wear slacks. I remember a woman who wrote to us. She'd had polio as a child. Her legs were disfigured, and so she had worn slacks all of her adult life. And she went to this particular church that I shall not name, and she wanted to attend with them. They said if she did, she had to wear a skirt. She was utterly embarrassed and chagrined. She didn't want to wear a skirt because of the disfigurement of her legs, and asked, couldn't she wear slacks? I think it may have taken them 2 or 3 months to figure out this formula, and they may have had who knows how many caucuses and meetings that may have gone all the way back to their headquarters. Who knows how many hours they spent on it until somebody came up with the idea, why not wear a skirt, a long skirt, over the slacks? And so I guess that's what she was supposed to do, and that made it okay. I told you about my wife and my mother being forced to go back to get a little handkerchief to wear over their heads and to put sweaters on their arms because they had short-sleeved summer dresses on, because from here down is awfully sexy, you know, on most women. And while they were going back to the car at Il Duomo in Milano in Italy, where the big basilica was, where the man was going to ordain some priests that day who later became Pope, and I watched him do that ordination, my brother and I were solicited on the front steps standing by the door of this big church by a pimp, asking us if we would like to go with the prostitute standing over there. And that was perfectly all right, of course, to take place on the steps of the church, but my mother and my wife could not go into church because that wasn't religious enough, because their arms weren't covered and they didn't have a scarf on the top of their head. You know, oftentimes people are looking for things that are even more dramatic in religion, and they're open to suggestions. And if you give them a suggestion, sometimes even in fun, they'll, with alacrity, leap upon it. Let me show you an example in 1 Kings, the 18th chapter. I had a lot of fun with this the very first time I ever read it, and I still have fun with it reading it today. In 1 Kings, the 18th chapter, we read of how one of the greatest of all of God's prophets, Elijah, was having a little bit of fun with the priests of Baal. He said, beginning in verse 21, "How long halt ye between two opinions? If the eternal," that's Jehovah or Yahweh, and by the way, that's another little form of religion you got to be careful about. Some people think if you say it just a certain way, just that way, it's righteous, but if you say it another way, it's not. That's why many of them talk about the Lord. You probably didn't hear what I said. Well, it's difficult to get that. You've got to come down to Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Texas to get that. You don't hear that much up in Oregon except on TV. But there are certain ways you say it. So some people think that if you just pronounce a name in a foreign language, you want some good ammunition for that argument? Just turn to the 2nd chapter of the book of Acts, where it says, how is it we, Greeks, Medes, Parthians, Cretians, Galatians, people from all over this eastern world with all these different dialects and languages, how is it we each hear these men talking about the mighty works of God in our own language? They wouldn't have known what those men were talking about if they'd spoken Hebrew for the name of God. So when they got to the name of God, if they were speaking to a Spaniard, they would have said Dios or Jesucristo nuestro Señor. They would not have said God or Jesus Christ, but Jesucristo. And these men, in the miracle that was provided by God's Holy Spirit, spoke the name of God in that tongue, if you just want something in passing as ammunition against that argument. But if Baal be God, then follow him. And the people would not answer him. And he said he was the only one remaining, so he said, therefore, let us take these 2 bullocks. You choose one for yourselves and cut it in pieces, and told them how to do it. And you call, verse 24, in the name of your gods, and I'll call in the name of the eternal. And the God that answers by fire, let him be God. And all the people said, that's a good idea, we will do it. So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, you take the bullock and dress it first, and you start calling on your gods, but don't light any fire under it. They took the bullock, they dressed it, and they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. Now that became a little tedious. They may have started out 7:30 or 8 o'clock, and it was getting on toward 11:45. They're still saying, oh, Baal. Now maybe they said, Baal. Baal. There were probably ways to say Baal. You don't just say Baal, because he doesn't like that. See, you got to say Baal. Spooky. And then he'll get it. See, that gets through. That's a communication. He'll listen when you say it that way. Some people think that God is like that. If you say Lord, he hears you, but you just talk about the Lord, he's not listening. So they thought that they had to get in communication. And until noon they say, oh, Baal, hear us. But there was no voice, nor any that answered. Isn't that strange? Imagine that. And they leaped, and actually look in the margin, it says they halted or they limped. And that was an affectation. You know, they have certain ways that you walk, and I don't know how many people have stumbled and fallen. They're trying to get married, for pity's sake. They're just trying to get married. They're coming down the aisle. And, oh, no, wait a minute. You take a half a step and then another half a step. And that's hard to do until you've been to a square dance or something, and you don't know how to walk. Well, they limped. They had an affectation to walk a certain way, and it was a religious step that they used. But there was no voice, nor any that answered, and they leaped upon the altar. That is, they limped about the altar which was made. And it came to pass at noon that Elijah mocked them. Now, there it is again, and I'm not going to apologize for that. I know that Elijah probably would have got some mail too for taking exception and for making fun, Now, making fun of these prophets of Baal, and they were sincere men, and probably good men too. And he was making fun of them. And he mocked them, and he said, cry aloud. So obviously they weren't doing that. They were saying, Baal, Baal. And he was saying, cry aloud, go ahead and shout. And they thought, boy, that's a good idea. We haven't been doing that. Let's try that. They were susceptible to a suggestion. For he is God. Either he's talking, and you've got to interrupt. If he's talking, you've got to over-talk him a little bit. Or he is pursuing, probably out with the dogs hunting quail. Maybe he's running around on the horse with the chariots and he's hunting lions or something up there. Or he's in a journey. He's paddling a canoe down the river Styx. There's no telling where he is right now. Or peradventure he sleepeth. Elijah was having fun about this time. I know that hurts some people, maybe touches a sore spot, but I think Elijah was having fun about this time, just coming up with all these innovative ideas how to job these guys. And he was having fun. Peradventure he sleepeth and must be awakened. And what do? They cried aloud. They took that suggestion. They immediately did what Elijah suggested. They cried aloud. They hadn't been before. And they cut themselves after their manner with knives and lancets. And they started to bleed. The blood gushed out upon them. They hadn't even begun to bleed the way they were going to bleed a little later. God was going to let them bleed all right. You'll find that a little later. And it came to pass when midday was past, and they prophesied until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, that there was neither voice, nor any to answer, nor any that regarded. The world's longest tarry meeting. They were there all gory and cut and bleeding and dancing and leaping, and did they look pitiful, and were they having fun? They were having a lot more fun than Elijah. They were enjoying every minute of it. Each one could look at the other one and say, boy, he's all bloody. I wonder if I better cut myself one more time here and get just as bloody as he is. And they were just thinking, man, this is righteous. Isn't this a wonderful exercise? And Elijah said, come here unto me. And all the people came near unto him. And he repaired the altar of the eternal that was broken down. And it could not be of hewn stone, but just natural stone. And Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, unto whom the word of the eternal came, saying, Israel shall be thy name. And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the eternal, and he built a trench around it so it would hold a lot of water, as great as could contain 2 measures of seed. And he put the wood in order, and cut the bullock in pieces, and laid on him the wood, and said, fill 4 barrels with water, and pour it on the burnt sacrifice and on the wood. Just drenched it and soaked it, just deluged it with water. And he said, do it again. They did it the second time. He said, do it the third time. And the water ran about the altar and filled the trench also with water. And it came to pass at the same of the offering of the evening sacrifice at the time that Elijah came near and said, now if you want a stopwatch on this, I think it takes about 11 seconds. This is the length of Elijah's prayer. It said, Eternal God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things according to your word. Now, maybe that only took about 6 seconds. Fairly short prayer, isn't it? Hear me, O Eternal. Well, he's still praying at this point. Hear me, that this people may know that you are the eternal God, and that you have turned their heart back again. And then the fire of the eternal fell, and consumed the burnt sacrifice, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and of course evaporated, licked up all the water that was in the trench. And the people saw it, and fell on their faces, and they said, the eternal, he is the God, he is the God. And notice their language. Not he is God, but he's the God that we ought to turn to, and so on. Well, a little later on, you see that Elijah said, the next verse, don't let any of these rotten people escape. Why? Because they had actually gotten their liturgy so developed that as you read in Amos about the 6th chapter, and a lot of other places in the Bible, Amos 5, they were sacrificing their own children unto Baal. So they were rearing little daughters and sons for a special purpose, to be put to death to a non-existent God. The Pharisees absolutely reveled in liturgy because liturgy is public worship. They wanted to do it in public. And what did Jesus say? He said, "You, when you pray, enter into your closet, and when your Father in heaven, which sees in secret, sees and hears this prayer, He will reward you openly." And of course, I've done recent television programs on that to show why I do not pray on television. Are there certain forms of dress that are holy? I've dealt with that before. In passing, let me say, because there was one gentleman in particular that didn't understand this, you can carry that to extremes. If this were the Philippines in the middle of the summer, I would probably be wearing a barang, and so would all of you, the men, because even the president, former president, now it's a female, and men, leaders in government, would be doing so. It's a national shirt, a very fine linen and fine needlework of different designs, and it's a short-sleeved, open-collared shirt. If I were in Israel, I might be wearing a short-sleeved, open-collared shirt, because even the members of the Knesset and the members of the head of state and government do the same thing. But because God's Word says, through the Apostle Paul, honor to whom honor, and custom to whom custom, I became all things to all men, that I might by all means save some, so long as society requires jackets and ties in some nice restaurants, and jackets and ties if you're going to meet the mayor, or maybe meet the governor, or certainly attend a presidential ball, and if you would do that in honor of a humanly elected official in your country, then it has become policy, and it shall remain policy, at least as long as I'm alive, and the rest of the members of the Board of Trustees, Ministerial Council, I'm sure, that when a man stands in the pulpit in front of God's people, he should wear a jacket and a tie. We really don't think that it looks really great to visitors and outsiders for someone to get up here with a short-sleeved shirt on, or a serape, unless we are having a Mexican dance. And even then, I don't think we do that on the Sabbath, see what I mean. The Pharisees absolutely reveled in liturgy. They wanted to do it out in public because it gave them a thrill. I'm not trying to put anybody down. I don't want to hurt anybody if they had a Catholic background, but the only place I ever saw a beautiful nun was from Hollywood. I've seen beautiful nuns in Hollywood. I mean, on the movies. But have you ever, I've traveled the world over and I've seen hundreds and hundreds. I've been to some of these places like near El Escorial in Spain. There is a cathedral carved out of the heart of a mountain that is actually big enough to swallow St. Peter's. It's a huge thing. And in the niches in the side are the bones of some of the Spanish Civil War dead who fell. And you'll walk along that huge floor and you'll see a mark in the floor that says, "This is the size of Westminster Abbey." And you look around and you can't believe your eyes. And here are these various nuns all over the place. So I've been to all of these Catholic countries, been all over Central and South America, been to all of the countries in Europe, and I've seen them by the thousands. I've never seen a pretty one. I'm sorry about that. I know there are some, but I'm just saying that it is not anybody's fault the way the skin is stretched over our face. But there are methods by which, no matter who we are or what we are, we will find, if there is enough vanity, if there is enough desire for sacrifice, enough desire for self-affectation and effacing and so on, to be able to find something in which we can express vanity. In which we can express vanity. In Matthew, the 12th chapter, in verse 1, I'll turn to that right quickly. Matthew 12 and verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the corn. Actually, if you read it in the original, it was not corn, because corn was never even discovered until the South American Indians were found to be growing it. And in the New World, corn finally was discovered. It is wheat that they were really rubbing with their hands. Began to pluck ears of wheat and to eat. And the Pharisees saw it, and they said unto him, "Behold, your disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day." They knew the Sabbath. But they'd added all these little ritualistic do's and don'ts. They had all these tremendous little rules and regulations about how to observe the Sabbath. But he said unto them, "Have you not read what David did when he was an hungered, and they that were with him, how he entered into the house of God and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat according to the law?" And this was not some added do or don't of the Pharisees, but God's law. "Neither for them that were with him, but only for the priests. Have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Now, profane in quotes because it was a technical profaning of the Sabbath. It was not actually breaking of the Sabbath, but it was a letter of the law, bending of a very rigorous rule that had nothing to do with the spirit of the law of the observation of God's holy Sabbath day. If you had known what this means, I will have mercy and not sacrifice. Now, what was it that they were sacrificing? Well, in addition to animals and tithing, there were all of these labyrinthal regulations and rules that regulated their lives. And every single day, in every way, there was some religious proscription or advice or restriction or something which guided every little thing they did. It had to do with their eating habits. It had to do with the Seder, when they would have, additionally to the Passover, the candlelight search with all the ritualistic statements and a responsive reading of the Father at the head of the table. And then the candlelight search by the little old Jewish grandfather in the nooks and the crannies of the house to see if there was one little speck of leaven, which, of course, Mrs. Levy had already gotten out of there a long time ago, but they went through the ritual nevertheless. If you look into the yarmulke, you look into some of the things that the Jews do even today in matters of dress and the headgear that is worn and so on, you will see a little bit of what I'm talking about. And Jesus said, and it's a very great principle, I will have mercy and not sacrifice. You would not have condemned the guiltless. Now turn to Micah, the 6th chapter. Micah, the 6th chapter. Just look after Jonah and back the other side of Nahum. Beginning in verse 6, wherewith shall I come before the Eternal? The people as if with one voice are asking, and bow myself before the high God. Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Eternal be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? If you can imagine rivulets of oil that is very, very costly, and you're actually pouring it out of vials, and you are giving it to God as a sacrifice. This is liturgy. This is a public display. This is public religion. It's ritual. Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression? Should we have sacrificed Mark? Should you have sacrificed your firstborn instead of having him by your side and watching him grow up? Instead of watching your children grow up and become like you and wishing them good life and long life and good health and happiness and success, you see their bodies burnt on a funeral pyre of some kind when you actually have put them to death, thus proving that you are better than Abraham. Abraham just sort of went through the motions, but he didn't follow through and really do it. But you could do it. I wonder if that felt good. Must have, or they wouldn't have done it. Can you imagine the wrath of God against His own people, Israel? Who was it? Who were the people who were doing this and following in the preaching and the teaching of these rotten people from Baal that some people out here are going to feel sorry for when they see Elijah making fun of them? They'll take the Baal part. There'll be a Baal party. They'll say, well, these poor old prophets of Baal, they're Elijah making fun of them. Well, he shouldn't have done that. They were sincere. You imagine the attitude some people have in judging God? They were burning their own children. Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Eternal require of you but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? I have said over and over and over again, and I guess people understand it, I hope they do, that I do not want to play church. This is something that I do almost recreationally. The bulk of my life is taken up from Monday right on through Friday, and oftentimes on Sunday too, especially if I'm traveling and had to be away in a personal appearance campaign in some other city, with preaching and teaching and writing and counseling and writing personal letters and helping people on the telephone. And I talk every single week to many different people who call in with nothing more than sometimes a Bible question, and teaching and preaching God's Word. Now let me give you a little analogy of how the Apostle Paul felt about a particular local congregation with which he had a lot of problems. And if you don't believe that, just turn back and read 1st and 2nd Corinthians. But let's go to the letter to the Corinthian church. This is in the Roman province of Achaia, which is the Peloponnesus, the part that looks like a hand that is severed from the mainland of Greece, the Peloponnesus of Greece. And let's look at the 11th chapter for a moment. First of all, he brands them false apostles who were preaching and teaching to that church, and they shouldn't have been, and said no marvel, because Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. And then he said in verse 16 of 2 Corinthians 11, I say again, let no man think me a fool, because some of them did. We learn some interesting things about Paul in this brief little portion here. First of all, that he wasn't much of a speaker. He also didn't have much of a personal appearance. It says very clearly that his physiognomy was repulsive. He had to write to the Galatians and say, you see the authenticity of this letter. You see how with such large characters I have written this with my own hand, and it's obvious that the messenger of Satan that buffeted him, for which he prevailed upon God 3 times, asking desperately that it be removed, had to do with his eyes. And I think probably some of the ugliest cataracts you ever saw. I think what you're dealing with is a man who was obviously a Benjamite, who had fairly plain, unattractive physical features with hideous whitish orbs, and who was a very slow, halting speaker. Meet the Apostle Paul. If you think he looked and sounded like Billy Graham, think again. Let no man think me a fool, if otherwise, yet as a fool receive me, that I may boast myself a little. That which I speak it not after the Lord, but as it were foolishly, in this confidence of boasting. Now let's just pretend for a minute you want to talk about physical comparisons and man's way of judging things. Let's just get into your vein of thinking, and we'll do it that way. Seeing that many glory after the flesh, I will glory also, because that's what they were doing. It was all racial, ethnic, fleshly. It was liturgy. It was outward show. And inwardly, what were they? Incestuous, drunk at the Passover, brother going against brother to the courts. Every evil you can imagine when you look through 1st and 2nd Corinthians was alive and extant in this local church congregation of these Gentile people there up in Greece. And Paul had to deal with this from his perspective, from his point of view. He said, you suffer fools gladly, seeing you yourselves are wise. At least that's what they thought of themselves. For you suffer if a man bring you into bondage, if a man devour you, if a man take of you. Oh boy, did they hurt. Why, they'd weep and bawl and caterwaul and pray, and they'd lash out and try to get vengeance. I'll skip ahead, and no, I won't either. I'll come to that a little later, because the Apostle Paul talked about how he took pleasure in infirmities and reproaches. Jesus Christ teaches us that. But I've given many a sermon about the straw that broke the camel's back, and about how people just draw this line, this religious line. They say, well, you can push me up to that point, and when you push me up to that point, boy, that did it. Now look out, because I'm really angry this time, see. And then they just throw all religion to the winds, and they show you what they really have been all the way along anyway. Totally unconverted. You know, the only trouble with Christianity is not too many people ever tried it yet. That's the only thing wrong with Christianity, is too many people have not ever really tried it. I mean, when it comes to crisis time, I'm not talking about when it's sitting in church comfortable and everything going well. I'm talking about crisis time here. I'm talking about angry time, put upon time, hurt time. I'm talking about time when you're all emotional and upset and something horrible's going on in your life. That's not the time you're going to use Christianity, is it? That's time to punch them out. Stab them, shoot them, burn down their house. Better yet, if you get some added societies, drive a pickup truck through a cafeteria window and pull out a assault rifle and kill everybody in sight. That's what some people do in this society, isn't it? You suffer fools gladly, seeing you yourselves are wise. For you suffer if a man bring you into bondage, if a man devour you, if a man take of you, if a man exalt himself, if a man smite you on the face. Now that would really break it with most of us, wouldn't it? If a man smites you on the face. I speak as concerning reproach, as though we had been weak. Howbeit whereinsoever any is bold, I speak foolishly, I am bold also. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Apparently that was important to these people. Are they ministers of Christ? Why, these are seed of Abraham, dyed in the wool, Jews, and ministers of Christ. And sometimes someone will say, do you know who you're speaking to? You're speaking to a minister of Christ. Is that what Jesus said when they were whacking him on the head and jamming the thorns down? Do you know who you're doing this to? No, he didn't say that. But boy, there are people who can act that way. Pull themselves up to their full little height of great, powerful vanity and egocentric, imperious hauteur and say, who do you think you are doing this to the greatest man on the face of the earth? Are they ministers of Christ? I am more, in labors more abundant. You know, let me just say something to you real quickly. It's amazing how if you stand up here in this pulpit, as I have done for so much of my adult life, and you write and you teach and you travel and you gradually grow older. See, there are 2 or 3 Garner Ted Armstrongs. There is the Garner Ted Armstrong that is, quote, known, end quote, by all these hundreds of thousands of people out there to whom television is their window to the world. It's a very intimate and a very private window to the world. Not a one of those people, if they're watching television, if some idiot rang the doorbell and said, I'm getting you, demon, I'm getting this demon out of here, and then get a point of contact. They'd say, call the police, dial 911, slam that door, lock it, sit down, grab the telephone. But they'll take that same guy and turn on the tube and invite him right into their living room, but they'd never think of inviting him if he's doing that on their front doorstep. And when you're living alone and you're elderly, and especially if you're infirm and you're lonely, and so many people have been abandoned by their own families, and their only window to the world, the only exciting things going on inside that little mobile home, and there are millions and millions of them out here, and these fakers and charlatans know it with their marketing companies that do it. They're not evangelists, they're merely religious fundraisers. And they know this, and they know the psychology of it, and they know how it works. The first time she turns in, the antics are sort of a turn-off. It's just curious. Oh, look at an idiot. You know, if you see somebody out in the middle of the street stopping the car and then doing a weird dance, you're going to stand and look because people gawk. We're like a bunch of chickens. That's why you slow down when there's a wreck on the freeway. Look at there, bodies. Hope we get there in time before they carry all the bodies away. You know, people look. They rubberneck at a wreck. And we're just that way as human beings. So if somebody starts just acting up, you know, acting weird like Jerry Lewis doing a dance out in the middle of the freeway, you can guarantee he's going to get a crowd. And so the first time or two, curious, weird, strange, turn off. Second or third time, try to listen to what he says. You kind of get behind all the gesticulations and facial wry grimaces and so on. And after a few months, a kind of an easy familiarity. And after a year or so, he's your friend. And you know him. And you trust him. See, there's a Garner Ted Armstrong out there like that, who doesn't exist. He does not exist. That's not me. I'm not that way. I preach God's Word, and I try to do it just as naturally as it's possible for me to do because I just don't put on television. I'm no different on television than I am in person or out of the pulpit. I don't read words that somebody else typed out for me and see them coming. It says smile. Oh, and by the way, gesture. God says never, you know, I don't do that kind of thing. I just look into the camera, and then whatever is in here comes flowing out with God's help. Then there's another Garner Ted Armstrong that is known basically by the church and the people who come to the Feast of Tabernacles, and that's not me either. That's not me. I'm getting at something here. Because you see, there are a lot of people out here that get hurt. But I don't. A lot of people out here get very put upon. I don't. A lot of people out here get, you know, just terrible things that happen to them. It just makes them weep and puts them down, just makes them feel horrible the way other people treat them. I don't. See, here's what Paul said. Just read it very, very clearly. He said, are they ministers of Christ? So am I. I'm more. Verse 23, in labors more abundant, in stripes above measure. Thank God that's never happened to me yet. I haven't been grabbed and beaten. It may happen at some time, but it hasn't yet. In prisons more frequent. I've never spent a single night in jail. Thank God. But if I do, I hope it's for the sake and the name of Jesus Christ and His work, and not because of something I've done that made me deserve it. In deaths oft, that is, meaning other people around him dying, seeing people dying, and being near death himself. Of the Jews, 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. How would you like to be beaten with a cat o' nine tails, 39 lashes, with a big 6'6" guy wielding the whip 5 different times? His back must have been an absolute ugly mess of scar tissue when you think about it. Thrice I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned, and he was left for dead, and his disciples, the other guys with him, came out there. The other people thought they'd killed him. He couldn't find a pulse. He was a bloody mess, and they dragged him away, and he was in such a deep coma or a faint that over days he came back. But he was near death at that time, and God spared him. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I've been in the deep. I haven't. I was aboard a ship for 2 years and went across and back and forth across the Atlantic on the Queen Mary, but I never got shipwrecked out at sea. I've never been floundering around out there in about 58 degrees of salt water for a day and a night, hanging onto a spar. Would that terrify you? Would that scare you half to death? Would you feel a little bit put upon? In journeyings often. Well, I've done that. In my lifetime, I've probably traveled, who knows how many hundreds of thousands of miles. In my work, in God's work, and traveling around the world, I've flown 68 different kinds of aircraft and 11 kinds of jets. I've been on so many hundreds of jets and puddle jumpers and other aircraft, and sometimes when things go wrong with them, and you're sitting there, sitting a little light, and you hear a sudden pop or a crack or something, or an engine goes out, or they say like they did one time when I was aboard, well, we're going back, they said there's a bomb aboard. It makes you think about it. In journeyings often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, well, I've had that. In perils by mine own countrymen, yeah, like the telephone call a few weeks ago, there's a bomb, Garner Ted's going to die. Or like the time a couple of times at the feast when I'd hustle aboard the jet and it'd get me back around the corner because a man had been seen around the grounds with a rifle. You do think about that, but not me, because you see, I'm never put upon. I don't hurt like other people. I'm big. I'm Garner Ted. I'm up here in the pulpit. So when people turn away from me, or people reject me, or people say evil things about me, I don't hurt like you other people do. That's what Paul's saying. Paul doesn't hurt like other people. No way, because he's Paul. So he said, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, beside those things that are without, that which comes upon me daily, the care of all the churches. What was Paul's life's work? Preaching the gospel. Where? Over the whole Grecian world, from Spain to Jerusalem. And travel was not aboard 747s, 727s, and Falcon jets back in those days. It was old Arab feluccas and Roman galleys and ancient creaky old waterlogged tubs that were in danger of Eurocyclodons, as they were called, which did tear up one ship he was on and shipwrecked the whole lot of them and killed a tremendous number, apparently. Well, I think no, Paul, in this case, because God interceded for him, they all got to shore on Malta alive. And then a snake came out and bit him, and God spared his life on that occasion. Besides all of that, the care of all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak. But they didn't think about it that way. It had never occurred to them. These people that were so proud of their scars. These people that were so proud of being put upon. These people that would just weep and just bare the breast and beat the bed, oh, woe is me, when something went wrong spiritually in their little local church. Who is offended? And I burn not. If I must needs glory, I'll glory of the things which concern my infirmities. Then he went on, and I won't read all the rest of this marvelous vision he was given, but look at verse 7 of 2 Corinthians 12 to conclude here, just a few more verses, a very important point to close. Lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan, to buffet me. And he said, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Eternal thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, my grace, my forgiveness of you, the fact that he had actually put people to death, he had tortured people and made them curse God. My grace is sufficient for thee. That's all you need. My strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities. Paul didn't say, that's the breaking point, that's the straw that broke the camel's back. That did it. Not Paul. In reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses, and it was, of course, in the name and for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I am become a fool in glorying. You have compelled me. For I ought to have been commended of you, ought to have been appreciated and commended, but instead, in nothing, he said, am I behind the very chiefest apostles, though I be nothing. Truly the signs of an apostle were wrought among you in all patience, in signs and wonders and mighty deeds. The Soviet Union has disintegrated, and a commonwealth has replaced it. Japan is a creditor nation that by the turn of the century will be $1 trillion positive, and we will be $1 trillion negative. Germany has been reunited and is at the helm of a United States of Europe forming, and just the other day beginning to adopt a common currency. All of my life I have wanted to preach the gospel of the kingdom of God as a witness and a warning to the world. I don't want to play church. I shall not play church. I will not experience a religious implosion. When I stand up here and tell you of the wonderful things we're trying to do, of the magazine coming out once a month, of a summer program I'm not willing to cancel, of the things that we hope we can do and achieve and accomplish, then I see that people will sink into this local attitude of a sort of a localized spiritual implosion. I warn people, and perhaps from my vantage point of nearly 62 years of age, I can call some of them who are younger my children in the gospel. Do not, step by step, go down the road toward Pharisaical separatism. Do not become so apart that you become better. Don't become so separate that you would never think of talking to someone who was a known prostitute. When do you rub shoulders with people in the world? I do all the time. Every day to some extent. And when we're traveling, very often. We ought to think about that, because if we do not, we may follow along in what I've already seen happen to a religious organization in my time that started out with such wonderful, fabulous truths, all of these things that we know and understand about the attitude of Christ, of how Christ wants us to treat other people, and gradually came to the place where we got a letter just this Friday morning in our prayer breakfast of a woman who wanted so badly to be baptized, but was told, no, you can't until you have saved enough money to at least attend one Feast of Tabernacles. And she says, why can't I be baptized? I've tried everything to be baptized. We're going to get over there just as quick as we can and baptize her.